Our victory in Tunisia, greeted by those to whom it brought the dignity of freedom, meant that an entire continent was now liberated. The flowers with which our soldiers were garlanded, the bells which rang their joyful peals, were a sign of men and women's relief that the yoke had begun to be lifted, that liberty and sanity were returning, and that the first stage of the Allied task was ended. It was in Washington that the North African campaign was planned by Mr. Churchill and President Roosevelt. The date was June 1942, a time when the war outlook was dark. In the Western Desert, we had lost Tobruk, crossed the Egyptian frontier, and were rapidly falling back to El Alamein. In Russia, Hitler had begun his drive aimed at the Caucasus with its oil and at the envelopment of Moscow by way of Stalingrad. The success of both or either of these thrusts would have imperiled the entire Middle East and Persia beyond, with its oil supply and its route to Russia by the Persian Gulf. Moreover, India would have been in danger on both frontiers, from the Nazis in the west, at a time when the eastern frontier was threatened by the Japanese from the east. At sea, our resources were stretched to the uttermost. In the Atlantic, our lifeline was being attacked by U-boats in packs of 20. To Archangel and Murmansk, our convoys fought through days of battle. The Mediterranean was almost closed by reason of enemy airfields on both shores. Malta was maintained by the Royal and Merchant Navies and the Royal Air Force only at heavy cost. To the Middle East and India, our only route was via the Cape, a journey of 12,000 miles, equal to going halfway round the world. The two main tasks that confronted Mr. Churchill and President Roosevelt were to maintain our bases intact, Britain, Middle East, India, and to ease the burden on Russia by striking fresh blows in the West. But until the Mediterranean was open to our ships and Africa was freed, our blows would have neither the strength nor freedom of movement needed. Those two imperatives could be achieved only by capturing the airfields from Alexandria to Algiers. That done, the Mediterranean would be under our control. One ship direct to Suez would do the work of two round the Cape, and the springboard for Europe's invasion would be ready. First, the freeing of Africa. Second, into Europe. Those were the Washington decisions. After 4 months of day and night work by chiefs of staff, by heads of Army, Navy, Air Force, and War Transport in London and Washington, by ministries of supply and food in both countries, by millions of munitions workers and shipbuilders, the weapons and material for the new campaign were rushing to the ports and harbors of Britain and America, where the ships were assembling. The greatest combined operation in history was being shaped, and secrecy was imperative. Nobody in the ports knew the ship's destinations. Ships had to be altered for the job. Davits changed from boats to landing craft. Telephones fitted from bridge to sally ports. Cargo liners were made ready to carry troops, and most of the ships needed additional armament for defense against enemy aircraft. More powerful derricks were fixed so that each vessel could handle her own cargo. Loading the ships was a double problem. First, every inch of space had to be used, so that men worked with ship's plans, with models and drawing boards, almost like architects. And second, every weapon had to be packed so that it came out in exactly the right order and ready to fight. Tanks and lorries sailed with petrol inside them, and with steel slings under their wheels, ready for the lift. Heavy loads were carried on deck. It was the first time in this war that ships had been loaded tactically in this way. Risks were taken. They had to be. Ship's crews and dockers were as keen as the brass hats. One ship, whose normal turnaround was a week, turned round in a day. When a vessel was damaged on her way to the assembly port, it was her crew who repaired her. Dockers broke records in the tonnages they put aboard in one shift. They loaded by day and they loaded by night. Guns, trucks, petrol, water, food, ambulances, barbed wire, aircraft, locomotives, they handled all these and infinitely more. Of ammunition alone, we shipped 520 different sorts. To begin an expedition, each soldier needs 10 tons of material, and after that, half a ton a month to keep him going. Before the campaign was over, more than 1,000 ships from Britain and America were to take nearly 2,000 aircraft, close on 1,000 tanks, nearly 4,000 guns, over 65,000 vehicles, over 250,000 tons of petrol and oil, and much besides. And every ship sailed on time. Convoy of mighty ships, hundreds strong, was moving in its appointed stations across the seas. Nothing like it had disturbed the waters since the world was made. Here were the ships which Hitler said we didn't possess, engaged on a task which he had deluded himself was impossible. The Royal Navy kept ceaseless watch and guard, by destroyers in close support, by cruisers on the flanks, and by battleships forming a powerful screen several miles ahead. From the decks of aircraft carriers, the fleet air arm rose to patrol the skies and search the seas for U-boats. Far and wide flew Catalinas and other aircraft of Coastal Command engaged on the same duty. For months before, they had hunted U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. There were times when the voyage was like a pleasure cruise, but a lot of hard work was done. Almost every day, in sunlight and the sea wind, men had the last touches added to their fitness for the stern fight ahead. The domestic virtues were not overlooked. Men read their books and wrote their letters home, describing perhaps the whales and flying fish they hadn't yet seen, or they looked towards the far horizon and pondered on the high adventure that lay beyond. Well out at sea came important news from Egypt. The Air Force's part in this combined operation was proceeding day and night. Even as the convoys sailed on, we were hammering the Italian supply bases at Genoa, Turin, Naples, and Milan. It was at night that the convoy passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. The time was carefully chosen, for here in narrow waters, attack seemed certain. In the convoy and at Gibraltar, everyone stood to, but the ships moved steadily on. It was as though, for the moment, the enemy's sword had fallen from his hand through indecision. Next day, U-boats were detected, and destroyers rushed to the attack. This was the eve of invasion. Events planned 6 months before moved to a climax. The last inspections were made, and from ship to ship, secret orders were now passed. The ships themselves moved towards the various ports and landing beaches to which they had been assigned, and for which everything they carried in men and material had been specially chosen. Below decks, the destination and the plan were outlined. A great convoy from America, timed to arrive with ours, was approaching Casablanca. The British convoy was to be split, part to Oran and the rest to Algiers. Landings were to be simultaneous. The weather was perfect, no cloud and a light wind. 0 hour was fixed 1 hour past midnight. The signal K on the ship's siren. At Algiers, as our landing craft went in, they were fired on by a shore battery, which was, however, soon silenced by ships of the Royal Navy. Immediately the assault began, the French troops ashore were asked by radio to indicate a friendly attitude by throwing their searchlight beams vertical. It wasn't long before here and there along the coast, a searchlight was seen pointing straight to the heavens. When dawn broke, RAF fighters from Gibraltar, fitted with long-range tanks to reach Algiers, took off without waiting to hear whether we had captured landing grounds. Gibraltar was the first headquarters of General Eisenhower and a keystone in our plan. By 7 a.m., the resistance at Algiers was finished. British and American troops had landed east and west of the city, penetrated 10 to 15 miles, and held the heights and all vantage points. Men, material, and ammunition were going ashore freely. The Americans had taken Maison Blanche airfield, where our fighters from Gibraltar were landing, and where RAF personnel were ready to service them. Protection for the beaches was now taken over from the Fleet Air Arm. In Algiers harbor, where cranes and quays were still intact, the first ships of our armada were unloading. A British destroyer 6 hours before had crashed the boom and landed American Rangers to prevent sabotage or the scuttling of merchant ships. The first prisoners we took in North Africa were 300 men of the German and Italian Armistice Commission, who for over 2 years had been organizing Axis forces. They went, bag and baggage, as surprised and discomfited as the citizens of Algiers were pleased. At Casablanca and Oran, where American forces had landed with the help of the United Navies, opposition was stubborn and fighting at times bitter. But here also, within 3 days, hostilities had ceased and French Morocco and Algeria had joined with us to free Africa. Events moved swiftly. To Algiers came Air Marshal Welsh, commanding the RAF, and General Anderson of the First Army, the embodiment of tenacity. General Giraud now placed himself under the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, a fine strategist and with a genius for cooperation. Although our First Army was as yet little more than one division, the 78th, and the bulk of the American forces were for the moment needed to safeguard the position in the west, an immediate advance into Tunisia was decided on. It was a bold decision, for roads were poor, railways inadequate. Even more important, we lacked as yet forward airfields. The enemy beyond the mountains had short supply lines from Sicily to Tunis and from Sardinia to Bizerta. Our own, stretching forward from the improvised base at Algiers, were 4 times the length. In the beginning, the RAF's vital work was bound to be meager, whereas the enemy had in Tunisia all the airfields he needed. In less than a month, the weather would break. Could our small force, in the last glory of autumn, achieve a flashing success against time and a stronger enemy? With immense energy, the attempt was made. By road, our infantry and tanks moved towards the hills. By rail went General Giraud's men with mules for mountain transport. By air flew British and American parachutists to capture suitable ground for airfields and the tactical points nearby. By sea went commandos to Bougie and Beaune, the latter 300 miles to the east and 2/3 of the way to Tunis. Here, the airfield which our parachutists had taken was already under attack from the Luftwaffe. This was our only permanent airfield right forward, and it had to be fought for repeatedly. The enemy lost no time. Using all his resources, he brought regiments by air and by sea. Malta struck hard at them, and our submarines took their toll, sometimes attacking within a few cables' lengths of hostile shores. But still the enemy came to Africa. By mid-November, his numbers were growing by 1,000 a day. Field Marshal Kesselring, Mediterranean Commander-in-Chief, was among the reinforcements. "12 days after our first landings, American field artillery and British paratroops had reached Béja, 450 miles by road from Algiers. To them came news that 30 miles distant in Medjez el Bab, the French general, General Barré, having refused Vichy orders to help the enemy, was holding the town against the Germans. To his support, the 78th Division and this mixed force promptly moved. Our attack was made in 3 columns. It was the right thrust that got nearest to Tunis. The capture of Taboba took us into the plains, where, the hills no longer protecting our small force, we were bound to be exposed to the full onslaught of enemy aircraft based on their permanent airfields at Tunis and Bizerta. The Germans reacted strongly as our center column, known as Blade Force, and our thrust on the right, moved towards them across the plains. We were within 15 miles of Tunis, and from the hills, our patrols saw the city. The crucial moment had been reached. Our first thrust had failed. Our columns were too slender. Gallantry of the most extreme sort had been shown, and the Victoria Cross had been won. But a withdrawal to the hills was unavoidable. We dug in, built a defense line, and prepared guns and armor for the next conflict. General Anderson chose the line, held the line, and shared his men's Spartan life. Already the hand of winter was touching the mountaintops. Behind the line, men worked as hard as others had fought, molding a countryside over which the legions of Caesar had marched and which had changed little since to the instrument of modern war. They built fords over rivers, turned ancient tracks into paths that would take lorries, put down miles of railway, erected telegraph lines, and created new airfields out of virgin countryside, the airfields vital to our success. All this to be ready for the spring. We were building the machine and the organization imperative for vital supplies to reach the troops, for swift communication to be maintained, and for our reinforcements of men and aircraft to get to the front in the right numbers at the right time. In the front line, patrol work was incessant. came, they brought in prisoners. And when night fell, they went out for more. Throughout this war, our men have held the initiative in patrols and fighting at night. And Tunisia was no exception. Life had now become bogged down with mud. Weapons were coated with it, dugouts foul with it, and clothing made heavy as lead. Roads turned into quagmires, and lorries and jeeps sank to the axles. Men struggled with mud as with an enemy. To keep airfields usable was a task of monstrous labor. Whenever the mud was dry enough, our fighter aircraft took off to tackle the Luftwaffe. Though still outnumbered, in 4 weeks they shot down 241 enemy aircraft for a loss of 89 of our own. Further back, the Strategic Air Force, with crews 90% American, was systematically destroying enemy bases in Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. Day after day and week after week, the fortresses went forth to kill the enemy's effort at its starting point. Air crews, who had been in the fight from the start, were now, as reinforcements arrived, getting some well-earned rest. And wounded and convalescent men went to the mountains to regain their strength. On January the 14th, 1943, President Roosevelt, making history by leaving his own country in time of war, arrived in Casablanca. Already there to meet him was the British Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill. They were accompanied by the combined chiefs of staff of the two countries, and in a small seaside hotel, meetings and discussions began immediately. Every theater of war was surveyed, and in particular, offensive plans were designed to relieve the pressure on Russia. Premier Stalin and General Chiang Kai-shek were kept fully informed. From Casablanca, Mr. Churchill flew on to Tripoli to greet the victorious Eighth Army, saying, "Your feats will gleam and glow, and will be the source of song and story long after those of us gathered here have passed away." The Eighth Army was now in pursuit of Rommel, fast retreating towards Mareth. Convoy after convoy was coming to North Africa, bringing the mounting supplies. From Gibraltar, aircraft which had been brought by ship and reassembled on the Rock were flown off to the front. Nearly 1,500 reached Tunisia by this route. Spring comes early to North Africa. Trees were putting forth their blossom. Brown soil turned green from the new crops, and daisies, irises, and bright patches of nameless little flowers made it seem the earth was changing color week by week. And even as the earth renewed itself and the sun grew warmer and more brilliant, so our armies were growing stronger also. Every village and farm was the scene of urgent preparations for the battle ahead, though the background was one of peace. The months of winter had been well spent. Great bases for repair and maintenance had been set up. The army, which had fought its early battles in mixed units of British, American, and French troops, was being regrouped into separate national forces. We watched the coming of spring with eager eyes. The enemy watched it with apprehension. For Rommel, standing behind his Mareth line, saw that he must soon be faced with an attack in the rear from the First and Allied armies and assault by the 8th Army at Mareth. He therefore decided to strike first. Withdrawing his re-equipped 21st Panzer Division from the Mareth area and strongly supporting it by dive bombers, he aimed a lightning thrust at the Allied forces which threatened the junction of the Axis armies. This thrust achieved initial success, taking Gafsa and the Kasserine Pass before it was held in front of Tebessa and Thala. He was then forced back, but he disengaged most of his armor, heavily mined the roads, and fought rearguard actions which kept the passes to the plain closed for many days. It was when the Kasserine battle was critical that General Alexander, who with Montgomery had hurled Rommel out of Egypt, took over command in the field of the 1st and 8th Armies and the 2nd American Corps. Air Chief Marshal Tedder, fighter and scholar, took over control of combined air forces, the whole under General Eisenhower. By the middle of March, the 8th Army was ready to attack at Mareth. Army and Air Force had long been welded together, but never had they been integrated as now. The new grouping had forged our two air forces, Western Desert and Northwest African, into one weapon, so that Air Marshal Cunningham, now commanding all the fighters and medium bombers, had a left and a right punch. He now attacked aerodromes and communications with his left, compelling Rommel to use his fighters behind the lines, so that our right punch could strike the Mareth line comparatively unmolested. From now on, this unified air strength was used with overwhelming effect. General Montgomery, looking ahead, had planned the Mareth battle 3 months before. He would strike after a barrage and in moonlight, as at El Alamein. But simultaneously, he would begin an outflanking movement on the left. The frontal blow had to cross a gorge, the Wadi Zigzag, and create a bridgehead under cover of which tanks and artillery could cross the Wadi before Rommel's counterattack in force would be made. 3 days before the attack, it rained heavily. The 50th Northumbrian Division had crossed the Wadi on which the enemy guns were trained and created the bridgehead, capturing several pillboxes and prisoners. News of this came to engineers struggling under shell fire to turn the morass in the Wadi into a causeway that tanks and guns could cross. The rains had done damage to an unexpected degree. our men were holding on like bulldogs. Only 4 tanks had got across, but with these and their own arms, our infantry kept the bridgehead intact. Rommel, fearing another El Alamein, the Northumbrians held the bridgehead in bloody and bitter fighting for a further 24 hours, and still the Wadi morass defied the sappers. For every British tank at the bridgehead, the Germans had 20. But the concentration of their armor in this spot had served our ends magnificently. The work of the 50th Division was done, and General Montgomery could order their withdrawal. Whilst this battle raged, our outflanking left hook by Freiberg and his New Zealanders, reinforced by the 1st Armoured Division, was racing across 150 miles of desert towards El Haman. The blow was now struck by 50,000 men on the ground and by bombers, fighters and tank busters from the air. Rommel, pinned down by the Northumbrians at Mareth, moved his armor too late. The left hook drove through. The Mareth line had been turned. The 8th Army was once more on the move, its speed made possible by the feats in road building of the South African engineers. The next heavy fighting was at Akarit. Twice the 8th Army had attacked in moonlight. Here Montgomery chose darkness. The enemy, taken by surprise, lost 2 key heights to the 4th Indian Division, which forced a further withdrawal. As the British drove north over the coastal plain, the American 2nd Corps, which had been engaging enemy armor in the region of El Guetar, struck forward to meet them. On April the 7th, our 12th Lancers met the American light tanks at Kilo 67. On this bright, sunny afternoon, the Allied pincers had closed. Rommel was now in full retreat. If he thought of standing at Sfax, a British-American drive from Pichon dissuaded him. 2 days later, our 1st Army occupied Kairouan, the 5th holy city of the Muslim world. Amid rejoicings, German signs were torn down, and Jewish boys could now remove the humiliating yellow star. As our armies pressed on, bringing a new security and peace to the land in their wake, a great homecoming started. Families banished by fear to the hills trekked back to their towns and villages. The pulse of decent life began to beat again. We had foreseen the people's needs and prepared for them. In the liberated towns, food and clothing were given to the needy. Hope lifted its head. Tomorrow was no longer a dreaded day. Our British and American doctors set about curing the people's illnesses, searching out and destroying sources of disease, and testing and purifying the scanty supplies of water. By April the 20th, after 7 weeks fighting and pursuit, the 8th Army had driven the enemy beyond Enfidaville. The United Navies throughout the campaign had ravaged Rommel's supply lines. Our submarines, often risking shallow waters in moonlight, sank 47 ships, and our surface craft 42 more. The Navy and Air Force together, much of it based on Malta, sent to the bottom over a third of all that ventured out. And a lot of that which got to Africa had a short life. With the enemy compressed into the Tunisian tip, General Spaatz and General Doolittle began a round-the-clock blitz on the airfields and ports of Tunis and Bizerte. These ports were to be made not harbors of ships, but graveyards of ships, and the Luftwaffe was to be destroyed before it was even born into its own element. Land fighting now moved to a climax. Our armies were confronted by mountain strongholds, the fighting for which General Eisenhower warned the armies would be bloody. The 8th Army struck at Takruna, while the French attacked Jebel Mansour. Throughout, they had specialized in engagements among the hills and woods and done brilliant work there. General Alexander switched the American 2nd Corps from the south to the north, where they drove for Mater. They now had a front of 40 miles at 1,000 to 1,500 feet and very few roads. Yet in 2 or 3 days, they had 4 divisions in position and ready to fight. It was a masterly achievement. Further south, the 78th Division, now veterans of mountain warfare, assaulted Longstop Hill. Our aircraft, which controlled the skies, signaled our artillery the exact positions of enemy guns and strongpoints. For 12 days, the hills echoed with gunfire. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. When the German lines broke at last, their dead lay in hundreds, unburied on the battlefields. As the infantry went forward, our sappers and pioneers blasted new roads across the mountains. In 11 days, they built 14 miles. While the hill fighting raged, the British 9th Corps on the Gubalat Plain further south had struck with its armor towards Tunis, and doing so had drawn upon it most of the enemy's remaining tanks. Days, the struggle went on, and although we did not break through, our main purpose was achieved, the drawing to this southern battlefield of von Arnim's tanks and guns, and their destruction here. Thus we prepared for our final blow further north. The American Second Corps, linked with the French Corps d'Afrique, had now forced their way to the key town of Mateux. Stiff enemy resistance, dense undergrowth, and endless supply problems had been alike overcome. Already, over 1,000 prisoners had been taken. One after another, von Arnim's strongholds in the mountains were vanquished. Our Irish brigade had taken Jebel Tangucha at the point of the bayonet, and the French had captured Pont-du-Fas. The Germans had been outfought. They were now to be outwitted. General Alexander, aware of von Arnim's fear of our victorious 8th Army, reinforced that fear by heavy bombardments and local attacks from Montgomery's front. At the same time, he transferred the 4th Indian and 1st and 7th Armored Divisions from Montgomery's army to the north. where the First Army was to strike the mortal blow. The thrust von Arnim guarded his ribs against in the south smote him in the throat 20 miles further north. The Americans were striking towards Bizerta, often proclaimed impregnable. The British moved on Tunis. On May the 6th, the mightiest army Africa had ever seen moved forward. The tanks were in mass and no more disturbed by the Luftwaffe than if they had been parading in Piccadilly. With our own air forces were to fly 2,000 sorties. The metal of German resistance now proved to have the brittleness of cast iron. After only 8 hours fighting, the first objectives were gained and our armor crashed through. Not in Poland or France, or hitherto in Africa, had armored columns achieved such devastating power and momentum. Next morning, and within 30 hours of the last battle beginning, the Americans drove into Bizerta. They were the first of the Allies to impose and receive unconditional surrender in this campaign. Six hours later, the 11th Hussars and the Derbyshire Yeomanry surprised the German troops in their barracks in Tunis. Before the brief street fighting was ended, and with an occasional shot heard through the joyful shouts of the people, our army of liberation drove in. that even as Tunis was aflame with rejoicings, the 6th Armored Division was moving towards the neck of the Cape Bon Peninsula to split the 100,000 enemy massed there from the 150,000 held in the south by the 8th Army. The battle opened at Haman Leaf, and the gunfire was heard above the cheers in Tunis, 10 miles away. We expected to be held up at Haman Leaf for 10 days. We broke through in 2. In that time, the enemy's head had been struck from his body. No last glorious episode brightened the hour of their defeat. There could be no Dunkirk for them. Mussolini's African armies were no more. The white flag had grown to be almost a standard part of their equipment. As for the Germans, they had suffered a military disaster which, apart from Stalingrad, was the greatest and most bitter in their history. Their Africa Corps was finally extinguished. The 8th Army's old enemies went out like a candle in the wind. The Axis had lost 300,000 men. 5/6 of whom, uninjured, gave up the ghost. For every 5 men the Axis lost, the Allies lost only 1. The British casualties were 35,000, the American 18,000, and the French 15,000. Von Arnim, who had at first refused to surrender unconditionally, now did so. He was the 19th German general to become our prisoner. The Italian, Marshal Messi, who still fought when every German had laid down his arms, requested the honor of surrendering to the 8th Army. He seemed not displeased. Among the Germans were those who showed plain delight in capture. It was a new manifestation of the germ of defeat. Others remained sullen and arrogant, Nazis to the last. But whatever they were, they drove up in truckloads, an army on the move, but in an unaccustomed direction. Hitler, whose newly acquired silence is more eloquent than his ravings of the past, reflects on this new debacle. To Berchtesgaden, safe from all but himself, he summons his puppets to be tested and to reaffirm. Can the fabric of this new order, crumbling so strangely, be held together? When the icy winds and the burning sun have been alike hostile, will the more temperate winds of the Balkans, of France, and of Germany itself blow any kinder? As the shadows deepen round the Führer, King George brings to his armies the thanks of the British Commonwealth. He pays the visit serenely, quietly, that Mussolini had so theatrically prepared for himself. In the amphitheater of Carthage, mistress of the Mediterranean 14 centuries ago, Mr. Churchill gives his own inspiring message to the troops, saying, "Whatever the campaigns to follow, they will not overshadow this one. In unity of command and organization, and in the brilliance of achievement in the field, you have added fresh luster to Allied arms." Africa is free, and Europe that much nearer freedom. The liberating hosts are on the wing.